When the HOA tried to destroy a man's dam over unpaid fees, they thought they were taking back control. But when the next storm hit, they realized that dam was the only thing holding their neighborhood above water. What happened next turned their pride into disaster and left the entire HOA underwater, literally. The small, manicured neighborhood of Willow Heights had always been known for its perfect lawns, shiny cars, and a homeowners association that treated itself like royalty. At the edge of the neighborhood sat an old property, a sprawling stretch of land with rolling hills, dense trees, and a man-made dam that held back a wide, calm lake. That land belonged to Thomas Hale, a quiet, middle-aged man who had lived there long before the HOA even existed. Thomas had built the dam decades ago with his own hands, turning a simple stream into a shimmering body of water that not only added to the beauty of the land but also protected the lower-lying neighborhoods from flooding during the rainy season. But when Willow Heights expanded, its boundary stretched right up to Thomas's land, and with that expansion came trouble. The HOA board, run by a self-important woman named Brenda, believed every property touching their community lines should fall under their maintenance jurisdiction. They sent letters to Thomas demanding yearly dues, landscaping compliance forms, and property inspection schedules. Thomas ignored them, believing, rightfully, that he wasn't part of their community, but the HOA didn't like being ignored. Soon, the threats began. Letters piled up. They claimed Thomas owed years of unpaid association fees. They claimed his dam was an unauthorized structure posing a safety hazard to the community. None of it was true. His dam had been legally registered with the county long before the HOA had even been founded. But facts didn't matter to them. What mattered was control. When the warnings failed, the HOA took matters into their own hands. They held a private meeting, voting to remove the unapproved structure for the safety of the neighborhood. Without consulting the county or securing any legal approval, they hired a contractor, one of Brenda's cousins, to demolish Thomas's dam. On a quiet Monday morning, heavy machinery rolled up to the property line. Thomas was away in town for supplies. By the time he returned, it was already too late. The concrete was cracked, the steel gates ripped open. The water, once calm and restrained, began to roar. Within hours, the lake drained. Fish flopped helplessly in the mud. The once fertile land turned into a barren basin. The HOA celebrated what they called a victory for community safety. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, Thomas stood silently by the ruins of his dam, the empty lake glimmering in the last light. He didn't shout, he didn't threaten. He only stared, calculating, patient, because Thomas knew something the HOA didn't. That dam hadn't just held back water, it had held back everything that came from the mountains above. And now, with the dam gone, nothing was holding back what was coming. The following week, the skies above Willow Heights began to darken. The weather forecast called it a seasonal storm, but for those who had lived in the valley long enough, like Thomas, it was something far more dangerous. Every few years, the mountains behind his property would release weeks' worth of rain in just a few days. It was the very reason he had built the dam in the first place. By the second night, the rain came in sheets, pounding relentlessly against rooftops and washing down the newly exposed slopes where the dam had once stood. The empty basin filled quickly with runoff, but with no structure to hold it. The water began carving new paths through the soft earth. Streams merged into torrents, and torrents into rivers that twisted down toward the neighborhood below. Thomas stood by his window, watching the storm through the flickering light of his porch lamp. He had tried to warn the county about the HOA's illegal demolition, but bureaucracy moved slowly. And the storm didn't wait. The HOA, on the other hand, was busy congratulating itself. They had filed press releases, claiming they had prevented a potential hazard. Brenda even had her picture taken beside the ruins, umbrella in hand, smiling proudly as she called it progress. But by midnight, that smile had vanished. Water began pulling on Willow Heights Drive, creeping over sidewalks and swallowing the manicured lawns the HOA prized so dearly. The storm drains, designed to handle runoff regulated by Thomas's dam, quickly clogged and overflowed. Residents panicked as basements filled with murky water. The HOA hotline rang non-stop. But Brenda and her board had no answers. Meanwhile, on the hill, Thomas had already prepared. He moved his equipment, stored supplies in his barn, and kept his generators ready. His property sat higher than the rest, perfectly safe. Yet even as he listened to the thunder rolling across the valley, he felt no joy. Not yet. He had tried to prevent this. By dawn, the rain showed no sign of stopping. The lake that once stretched behind his home began to reform naturally, now uncontrolled, wild, and vengeful. It was reclaiming its place, spilling over its banks, tearing through the cheap fencing and decorative gardens the HOA had built too close to the flood zone. When the first retaining wall collapsed, the sound echoed like a gunshot through the valley. Fountains of muddy water surged down the streets, carrying trash cans, mailboxes, and freshly planted hedges. The HOA's perfect world was cracking apart, and as the residents scrambled for safety, one phrase began spreading among them, whispered in disbelief, tinged with guilt. They shouldn't have touched the dam. By the third day, Willow Heights no longer looked like a neighborhood. It looked like a lake with rooftops barely peeking above the surface. The storm hadn't stopped for a single hour. The water that once rested calmly behind Thomas's dam now surged uncontrolled through the valley, swallowing everything the HOA had spent years trying to perfect. Driveways disappeared under brown waves. Garden lights blinked and died beneath the flood. Cars floated like toys, crashing into fences and trees. The pristine lawns that once 1 yard of the month were now a churning swamp of mud and debris. Brenda and the HOA board took refuge in the clubhouse, their so-called command center. They shouted orders into phones, trying desperately to reach emergency services. But the roads were gone. The main access bridge had collapsed during the night, cutting the entire neighborhood off from the main highway. Even rescue boats couldn't make it through the heavy current tearing across what used to be Maple Ridge Street. In the chaos, residents began asking the same question: who had destroyed the dam? Who had signed off on it? The HOA's name came up again and again. Every homeowner who had once cheered for Brenda now turned their anger on her. The unpaid fees that justified the demolition suddenly seemed meaningless compared to the loss of their homes. Meanwhile, on the hill, Thomas watched quietly. His property remained untouched, dry, and secure, just as he had designed it decades ago. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same dam the HOA had called a danger to the community had been the only thing keeping that community safe. As the rain eased for a brief moment, Thomas walked down the dirt road leading to the valley. What he saw was both tragic and inevitable. The clubhouse's windows were shattered. HOA documents floated in the water. Pages smeared with ink and mud. Fences had been ripped apart, signs reading private property. HOA rules enforced were now half submerged in filthy water. Brenda stood outside, soaked and trembling, watching everything she'd built collapse around her. She finally understood, but understanding came too late. The county trucks couldn't reach them for another day, and when they finally did, the neighborhood was declared a disaster zone. But there was one small twist of fate still to come, one that would seal the HOA's downfall forever. Because Thomas hadn't just built that dam to protect his land. He'd also kept every permit, every blueprint, every signed county approval, proof that the HOA had destroyed a legally protected structure. And once the water cleared, those papers would surface. Meine Carlade kipivi muste ye. As you can learn all the Toria, at the Chike said, Shuvella, Safta, if you understand, Mun Stephanie, Mada, Pussy FFR, Putwag. I thought the very
Weeks passed before the water finally receded. What had once been the shining pride of Willow Heights was now a scarred wasteland of ruined homes, cracked streets, and abandoned cars. The smell of rot hung heavy in the air. Insurance adjusters came and went, shaking their heads. Most policies didn't cover negligence, and this disaster had negligence written all over it. When the official investigation began, Thomas finally stepped forward. He wasn't angry or loud. He simply presented the documents he had kept safe for decades, the legal permits, engineering diagrams, and the county's certification proving his dam was a registered flood control structure. He handed them over quietly, and the truth began to unfold like a slow-motion collapse. The county engineers confirmed it. The dam had been essential to protecting the lower valley from storm overflow. Its demolition had directly caused the catastrophic flooding. The HOA had acted without authority, without permits, and against written warnings that had been ignored. The news spread fast. Local headlines called it the flood of Willow Heights. Drone footage of the destroyed neighborhood went viral, showing the once flawless homes sitting underwater like abandoned boats. The HOA board tried to blame the contractor, but his paperwork showed he'd been hired and paid directly by Brenda under the HOA's budget. There was no escaping responsibility. In court, Thomas sat quietly as the judge reviewed the evidence. The HOA's defense crumbled instantly. Not only were they found liable for the destruction of the dam, but they were also ordered to compensate Thomas for property damage, lost land value, and environmental restoration, a figure that reached into the millions. When Brenda heard the verdict, she broke down, realizing what she had cost her community. But the real punishment came later. The HOA dissolved entirely, its charter revoked, its members scattered. Homes were foreclosed, lawsuits piled up, and the land that had once been Willow Heights was eventually sold for redevelopment. As for Thomas, he rebuilt the dam, stronger, higher, and fully backed by county engineers this time. The water returned, calm and glimmering once more beneath the morning sun. Birds nested by the shoreline again. Nature had healed, even if the neighborhood never could. And sometimes, when visitors passed by and asked about the story of the flood, Thomas would simply smile faintly and look out over the lake. He didn't need to say much. The silence told it all. Because some lessons, he knew, didn't need to be shouted. They only needed to be remembered.